I woke to the crisp morning air, the scent of pine mingling with the remnants of last night's campfire. The Ozark Mountains stretched around us, their dense forests cloaked in early morning mist. It was our third day camping, a group of college friends seeking adventure away from the stresses of campus life. We had chosen a secluded spot near a small creek, far from the well-trodden trails and bustling campsites. It felt like our own slice of wilderness paradise, a perfect escape from deadlines and exams. But paradise has its secrets, and we were about to uncover something dark and dangerous. It started with distant echoes, faint gunshots echoing through the trees. We froze, exchanging nervous glances. Hunting was common in these parts, but this sounded different. It was erratic, almost frantic. As curiosity got the better of us, we decided to investigate. Quietly, we followed the sound deeper into the woods, careful to stay hidden. The forest grew denser, the undergrowth thickening around us. Soon, we came upon a clearing where a group of men were gathered. They were armed, their rifles and shotguns laid out on makeshift tables. In the center, a couple of men were gutting a deer, their movements swift and practiced. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smell of gunpowder. One of the men looked up, catching sight of us through the trees. His eyes narrowed, suspicion darkening his expression. We froze, realizing we had been spotted. "Who the hell are you?" he called out, his voice rough and commanding. We exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to respond. Before we could answer, another man stepped forward, his grip tightening on his rifle. "We don't need any witnesses," he growled, his tone chilling. Fear gripped my chest, cold and paralyzing. I glanced at my friends, seeing the same terror mirrored in their eyes. Without another word, we turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, our hearts pounding in our chests. Behind us, we heard shouts and the heavy thud of footsteps. Branches whipped at our faces, roots threatened to trip us, but we pushed forward, driven by sheer adrenaline and fear. The shouts grew closer, urging us to run faster, to find safety. We veered off the trail, hoping to lose our pursuers in the labyrinthine tangle of trees. But they were relentless, crashing through the forest after us. Panic surged through me as I realized we were being hunted, like prey in a deadly game. "Split out!" I yelled to my friends, hoping to confuse our pursuers. We scattered in different directions, each of us racing through the forest, desperate to evade capture. I ducked behind a large oak tree, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my ears. Silence fell around me, broken only by the distant sounds of pursuit. I strained to listen, trying to gauge where the men were. Minutes stretched into eternity as I waited, my muscles trembling with exhaustion and fear. Finally, I dared to peek around the tree trunk. No sign of them. Had I lost them, or were they waiting, watching? I crept forward, every rustle of leaves making me jump. The forest seemed to close in around me, its shadows deepening with each passing moment. I needed to find my friends, to regroup and come up with a plan. I moved cautiously, staying low to the ground, my senses on high alert. Branches snapped underfoot, and I froze, holding my breath. But it was only a deer, bounding away through the underbrush. I continued deeper into the forest, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. I stumbled upon a rocky outcrop overlooking a small ravine, a potential hiding spot. I crouched down, scanning the area for any sign of movement. Hours passed, and still, there was no sign of my friends. The forest grew quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. I wondered if they had managed to escape, or if they were still being pursued. Just as I was about to move on, I heard a faint voice calling my name. Relief flooded through me as I spotted one of my friends emerging from the trees. We embraced, whispering hurriedly about what had happened, where the others might be. "We have to find them," I urged, my voice urgent. Together, We set off, calling out softly, hoping to avoid attracting attention. We searched for what felt like hours, our nerves fraying with each passing minute. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly around us, its secrets hidden in the shadows. Finally, we stumbled upon another friend, huddled behind a fallen tree. She looked pale and shaken but unharmed. We hugged her tightly, relieved to have found each other. "We have to get out of here," she whispered, her voice trembling. We nodded in agreement, silently vowing to find our fourth friend and escape this nightmare. We moved cautiously through the forest, every snap of twigs or rustle of leaves sending a jolt of fear through us. Suddenly, we heard shouting in the distance. Panic surged anew as we realized the men had found us again. We ran, pushing ourselves to the limit, desperate to reach safety. Through sheer luck or perhaps divine intervention, we stumbled upon a ranger station. Relief washed over us as we burst through the door, breathless and wild-eyed. The rangers listened to our story, their expressions grim. "We'll send out a search team," one of them promised, his voice steady. Hours passed as we waited at the ranger station, our nerves on edge. Finally, we received word that our fourth friend had been found, shaken but alive. The search team had escorted her to safety. We were reunited, shaken and scarred by our ordeal in the Ozark Mountains. I've spent my entire life in the Everglades. The swamps are my sanctuary, my playground, my home. I know every bend, every grove, every hidden path. That's why I wasn't worried when I decided to take a solo trip deep into the heart of the wetlands. It was supposed to be just another adventure, another day surrounded by the beauty and the danger of the wilderness I loved so much. The day started off like any other. I packed my gear, loaded up my canoe, and paddled into the labyrinth of waterways. The sun was shining, the air was thick with humidity, and the sounds of the swamp filled my ears. I felt at peace. I didn't have a specific destination in mind. I just wanted to explore, to get lost in the vastness of it all. By midday, I was deep in the swamp. The canopy overhead blocked out most of the sunlight, casting eerie shadows on the water's surface. I decided to take a break and find a dry spot to eat lunch. I paddled to a small island and pulled my canoe ashore. As I ate, I listened to the sounds around me, the distant calls of birds, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional splash of a fish jumping out of the water. That's when I heard it, a muffled cry, faint but unmistakable. I froze, straining to hear it again. There it was, coming from somewhere deeper in the swamp. My curiosity got the better of me. I packed up my things and set off in the direction of the sound. As I navigated through the dense foliage, the cries grew louder. I moved cautiously, aware that I was venturing into unknown territory. Suddenly, I heard voices, angry, harsh voices speaking in hushed tones. I crouched behind a thick clump of reeds and peered through the leaves. What I saw chilled me to the bone. A group of men stood around a small clearing, and with them were several people, their hands bound, their faces covered in fear. The men were armed, and it didn't take long for me to realize what was happening. Human traffickers using the remote swamp to transfer their captives. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound. My heart was pounding in my chest. I knew I had to get out of there and find help, but as I turned to leave, I stepped on a branch, snapping it under my foot. The sound echoed through the clearing. One of the men shouted, and I knew I had been spotted. I ran, not looking back, my feet slipping on the wet ground. I could hear them chasing after me, their shouts growing louder. My mind raced. I knew the swamp better than anyone, and I had to use that knowledge to my advantage. I headed for a thick grove of cypress trees, hoping to lose them in the dense foliage. I ducked under low-hanging branches, splashed through shallow water, and crawled through mud. The voices behind me grew fainter, but I knew I couldn't let my guard down. I reached a narrow stream and plunged in, letting the water carry me downstream. I swam as quietly as I could, using the current to put more distance between me and the traffickers. After what felt like hours, I climbed out of the water and took a moment to catch my breath. I knew I couldn't stay in one place for long. I needed to keep moving, to find a way out of the swamp and alert the authorities. I moved cautiously, listening for any signs of pursuit. The swamp was a maze, but I knew it well. I navigated through it with a mix of instinct and desperation. Night fell, and the swamp became even more treacherous. The darkness was almost absolute, and the sounds of the night creatures were all around me. I found a hollowed-out tree and climbed inside, hoping to hide until morning. My body ached, and my mind was racing, but I knew I had to stay alert. I dozed off for a while, but the sound of voices woke me. The traffickers were still searching for me, their flashlights casting eerie beams of light through the trees. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. After what felt like an eternity, they moved on, their voices fading into the distance. I waited until I was sure they were gone before climbing out of the tree. I needed to find a way out of the swamp, and fast. I headed for higher ground, hoping to get a better view of my surroundings. As I climbed a small hill, I saw a faint glow in the distance of the town, a beacon of hope. I made my way towards the light, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The ground was uneven, and more than once I stumbled, but I kept going, driven by the need to escape. As I got closer, I heard the sound of traffic and saw the outline of buildings. I stumbled out of the swamp and onto a road. I flagged down the first car I saw, a couple driving a beat-up old truck. They stopped, their faces filled with concern as I explained what had happened. They called the police, and soon a patrol car arrived. The officers listened to my story and immediately radioed for backup. They took me to the station, where I gave a full account of what I had seen. A search team was dispatched to the swamp, and by morning, the traffickers had been caught and their captives freed. I had been hiking the Pacific Crest Trail for nearly 2 weeks. It was my first solo trip, a journey I had planned meticulously. The weather had been perfect, the trail challenging yet rewarding. Each night, I found a new spot to set up my tent, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of nature. But on the 14th night, everything changed. I had found a secluded clearing, a perfect spot to set up camp. The trees formed a natural barrier, giving me a sense of security. As the sun set, I cooked my dinner, the smell of the meal mingling with the fresh pine air. The silence was comforting, the only sounds being the rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. After dinner, I settled into my tent, reading a book by the light of my headlamp. I felt at peace, tired from the day's hike but content. That's when I heard a twig snapping, the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving just beyond my campsite. I turned off my headlamp and listened, straining to hear. There it was again, closer this time. My heart began to race. I tried to reassure myself that it was probably just a deer or another animal, but the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I quietly unzipped my tent and peered out into the darkness. The moonlight cast eerie shadows, but I saw nothing unusual. I decided to stay alert, keeping my headlamp off to avoid drawing attention. After a while, the sound stopped, and I eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I packed up camp and continued on the trail. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I pushed it aside, focusing on the path ahead. The trail was tougher that day, steep inclines and rocky terrain making progress slow. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and still had no idea where I'd spend the night. As I rounded a bend, I saw a figure in the distance. My first instinct was to be cautious, but as I got closer, I saw it was a man, disheveled and dirty, sitting on a rock. He looked up as I approached, his eyes narrowing. "You're on my land," he said, his voice rough and accusing. "I'm sorry," I replied, trying to stay calm. "I'm just passing through on the Pacific Crest Trail." He didn't respond, just stared at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. I decided to keep moving, walking past him without another word. As I walked away, I could feel his eyes on my back, and I quickened my pace. That night, I found a less secluded spot to camp, hoping the proximity to the trail would offer some security. As I lay in my tent, I couldn't shake the image of a man's face from my mind. I kept my bear spray close, the only weapon I had, and tried to sleep. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a sound. It was the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the forest floor, coming closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the bear spray. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, praying they would go away. But then the tent fabric rustled, and a shadow loomed over me. I sprang into action, spraying the bear spray through the fabric and scrambling out of the tent. The man from earlier was there, clutching his face and screaming in pain. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed my pack and ran, not caring which direction I was headed, just wanting to get as far away as possible. The adrenaline gave me speed, and I didn't stop until I was sure I was alone. The next day, I was exhausted but determined to put as much distance between myself and that man as possible. The trail was grueling, but I kept moving, my senses on high alert. Every rustle, every sound, put me on edge. By evening, I reached a small outpost, a ranger station. I stumbled in, my appearance disheveled and frantic. The rangers listened to my story, their faces serious. They assured me I was safe now, but I couldn't shake the fear that had settled deep within me. I spent the night at the outpost, the safety of the building and the presence of others giving me some comfort. The next day, the rangers escorted me to the nearest town, where I could rest and recuperate. The experience left me shaken. The Pacific Crest Trail, which had once been a dream, had turned into a nightmare. We decided to go camping in the White Mountains of New Hampshire for the long weekend. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a break from our busy lives. The group included me, Tom, Sarah, and Mark, friends since college, always looking for an adventure. We packed our gear and drove up, excited for the fresh air and scenic views. We set up our camp near a secluded spot, far enough from the main trails to ensure privacy. The first day was perfect. We hiked, laughed, and shared stories around the campfire. As the sun set, we settled into our tents, feeling relaxed and happy. The next morning, while we were having breakfast, Tom noticed something odd. "Did you guys see that?" he asked, pointing towards the tree line. We all looked but saw nothing. Sarah shrugged it off, saying it was probably a deer. We laughed and continued with our day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We spent the day exploring, climbing some of the steeper trails. The views were breathtaking, and for a while, I forgot about Tom's comment. As we returned to our campsite in the late afternoon, I felt that uneasy sensation again. I glanced around but saw no one. That night, as we sat around the fire, the woods seemed quieter than usual. The typical sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by eerie silence. Mark suggested we turn in early, as we had another big day of hiking planned. We reluctantly agreed and went to our tents. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a rustling sound outside. I listened closely, my heart pounding. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like footsteps. I lay still, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Eventually, the noise stopped and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I told the others about what I heard. Tom looked concerned. I heard it too, he said. Mark and Sarah exchanged worried glances. We decided to check the area around our camp. That's when we found a crude wire trap set just beyond our campsite. It wasn't enough to seriously harm anyone, but it was a clear warning. Panic started to set in. We realized we weren't alone. Someone had been watching us, setting traps. We debated whether to pack up and leave immediately, but we were deep in the woods, hours from our car. We decided to stay alert and stick together. That evening, as the sun began to set, we saw them. Men in camouflage, blending with the forest, watching us from a distance. They didn't approach, just stood there, silent and menacing. Mark, trying to be brave, shouted, "What do you want?" They didn't respond, just continued to stare. We howled together, trying to come up with a plan. Sarah suggested we make a break for it at first light. Tom agreed, but I wasn't sure we'd make it through the night. The sense of dread was overwhelming. As darkness fell, we heard whispers and movement around us. The firelight flickered, casting eerie shadows. We took turns keeping watch, but sleep was impossible. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, set our nerves on edge. In the dead of night, one of the men approached our camp. He stood just outside the ring of light, a menacing silhouette. "You're trespassing," he said in a low, threatening voice. "Leave now, or it'll get worse." We tried to explain that we were just campers, but he didn't seem to care. He repeated his warning and disappeared back into the darkness. We knew we had to leave, but how? The forest was vast and dark, and they knew the terrain better than us. We spent the rest of the night in terrified silence. At the first sign of dawn, we quickly packed our things. We decided to take a different route back, hoping to avoid them. The tension was palpable as we moved through the dense forest. Every sound made us jump. We were hyper-aware of our surroundings, fearing an ambush. As we hiked, we heard them following us, always just out of sight. It was a twisted game of cat and mouse. We stumbled upon an old logging road and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead us back to civilization. The sense of relief was short-lived. One of the men stepped onto the path, blocking our way. He held a rifle, his expression cold. "Turn around," he ordered. We were trapped, nowhere to go. Desperation set in. Mark, always the quick thinker, whispered for us to scatter on his signal. Before we could react, he yelled, "Now," and we bolted in different directions. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding, branches scratching my face and arms. I could hear the others running too, and the men shouting behind us. I didn't look back, focusing on putting as much distance between us and them as possible. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small stream and followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. The sound of the water was reassuring, masking my footsteps. After what felt like hours, I emerged onto a road. I looked around, disoriented but relieved. I spotted a parked car in the distance, a couple loading their gear. I ran towards them, waving frantically. They looked at me in shock as I explained what had happened. They quickly offered me a ride to the nearest ranger station. At the station, I reunited with Tom, Sarah, and Mark. We were all shaken, but grateful to be alive. The rangers took our statements and assured us they would investigate. We left the mountains that day, our dream of a peaceful camping trip shattered. I decided to spend a weekend camping in the Badlands, hoping to find some peace and quiet away from the city. I packed my gear and drove out, the rugged landscape stretching out before me. The first day was perfect, clear skies, stunning views, and the solitude I craved. I set up my tent in a secluded spot and spent the evening watching the sunset, feeling content. As night fell, I built a small fire and cooked dinner. The silence was comforting, only broken by the occasional rustle of the wind. I went to bed early, eager to explore more the next day. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of voices. They were faint but unmistakable. I got out of my tent and quietly made my way towards the sound. I moved slowly, careful not to make any noise. The voices grew louder as I approached a clearing hidden by a cluster of rocks. I crouched behind them and peered out. What I saw made my blood run cold. A group of men were gathered around a fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They were dressed in suits, clearly out of place in the Badlands. I recognized a couple of them from the news, local politicians known for their corruption. As I watched, another group of men arrived. They were rougher, more dangerous looking. One of them opened a briefcase, revealing stacks of cash. The politicians nodded, and one of them handed over a thick envelope. I realized I was witnessing a clandestine meeting between corrupt politicians and criminals. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew I had to get out of there before they spotted me. I slowly backed away, trying to remain as silent as possible. But then, I stepped on a twig. The snap echoed through the clearing. The men froze and looked in my direction. "Did you hear that?" one of them said. I didn't wait to find out if they'd seen me. I turned and ran, my heart racing. I could hear them shouting behind me, their footsteps pounding on the hard ground. I pushed myself to run faster, but the terrain was rough, and my legs were already exhausted. I stumbled and fell, scraping my hands and knees on the rocky ground. I got up and kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I veered off the path, hoping to lose them in the maze of canyons and cliffs. The moon provided just enough light to navigate, but it also cast eerie shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I could hear them getting closer, their angry voices echoing up the rocks. "Find him," one of them yelled. "He can't get away." I found a narrow crevice and squeezed into it, trying to catch my breath. I could hear them searching nearby, their voices filled with frustration. I waited, praying they wouldn't find me. After what felt like hours, their voices faded. I cautiously emerged from my hiding spot, my body aching and my mind racing. I knew I had to keep moving. I headed towards a higher elevation, hoping to find a spot where I could get a signal on my phone and call for help. The climb was brutal, but I forced myself to keep going. Finally, I reached a plateau and pulled out my phone. No signal. Panic surged through me. I was alone and being hunted in the middle of nowhere. I decided to keep moving, hoping to find a better spot. As I walked, I tried to think of a plan. I needed to find a way out of the Badlands and get to safety. The landscape was treacherous, but I used every bit of my hiking experience to navigate it. I knew the thugs would be relentless in their pursuit. As dawn approached, I found a small cave and decided to rest for a bit. I was exhausted and needed to gather my strength. I sat at the entrance, keeping an eye out for any signs of movement. The cave provided some shelter, but it also made me feel trapped. I knew I couldn't stay there for long. After a short rest, I continued on, heading towards what I hoped was the direction of the nearest road. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the landscape. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see my pursuers at any moment. Every noise made me jump, my nerves frayed from the constant fear. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. My water supply was running low, and I knew I had to find help soon. I spotted a narrow trail that seemed to lead towards a more populated area. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. As I rounded a bend, I saw a group of people up ahead. Relief washed over me until I realized they were the same thugs who had been chasing me. They spotted me and started running towards me. I turned and ran in the opposite direction, my legs burning with effort. I could hear them closing in, their shouts growing louder. I spotted a dense thicket of bushes and dived into it, hoping to hide. The branches scratched my face and arms, but I didn't care. I lay still, my breath shallow, listening as they searched for me. They were so close I could hear their heavy breathing and the crunch of their boots on the ground. One of them walked right past my hiding spot, his eyes scanning the area. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible. After what felt like an eternity, they moved on, their voices fading into the distance. I waited a few more minutes before cautiously emerging from the bushes. I knew I couldn't keep running forever. I needed a new plan. I decided to head towards a ridge I'd seen in the distance. From there, I might be able to spot a road or some sign of civilization. The climb was steep and exhausting, but I forced myself to keep going. As I reached the top of the ridge, I saw a small town in the distance. Relief flooded through me. I carefully made my way down the other side, trying to move quickly without drawing attention. I was so close to safety. But as I descended, I heard voices behind me. They'd found me again. Desperation fueled my legs as I ran towards the town. I could see cars and buildings, so close yet so far. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning with effort. I burst into the town, running down the main street, yelling for help. People stared at me, confused and alarmed. I ran into the nearest building, a small diner, and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. "Help me," I pleaded. "They're after me." The staff and patrons quickly surrounded me, asking what happened. I explained in between gasps, and they called the police. The thugs arrived shortly after, but seeing the crowd, they hesitated and fled. The police arrived soon after and took my statement. I was safe, but the experience left me shaken. The Blue Ridge Mountains had always been a place of solace for me. I had spent countless weekends hiking its trails, finding peace in the vast, untouched wilderness. That weekend, I decided to venture deeper into the mountains than I ever had before, hoping to discover new trails and hidden waterfalls. I parked my car at a remote trailhead, shouldered my backpack, and started my trek. The first day was everything I hoped for. The air was crisp, the skies clear, and the only sounds were those of nature. I hiked for hours, marveling at the beauty around me. By late afternoon, I found a perfect spot to set up camp near a small, serene lake. I pitched my tent, made a small fire, and settled in for a peaceful evening. As dusk fell, I cooked a simple meal over the fire and watched the stars begin to twinkle above. The tranquility was intoxicating. I crawled into my tent, feeling a sense of contentment wash over me. I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the sounds of the forest. I woke up to a strange noise outside my tent. It was a rustling sound, followed by hushed voices. My heart started to race. I lay still, straining to hear. The voices were getting closer. I carefully unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. In the dim light, I saw two men moving through the trees, their figures dark and menacing. I quickly zipped the tent back up and held my breath. The voices were clearer now, and I could hear snippets of their conversation. "We can hide out here for a while," one of them said. No one will find us. Panic surged through me. They were clearly on the run, and I was right in their path. I knew I had to stay quiet and hope they moved on, but then I heard footsteps approaching my tent. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do. I grabbed my flashlight and my small camping knife, the only things I had for defense. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent, and I could see a shadow fall across the fabric. "Did you hear that?" one of them asked. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud I was sure they could hear it. I stayed as still as possible, willing them to go away. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, and I heard them moving further into the woods. I waited until I was sure they were gone, then slowly unzipped the tent. The moonlight cast eerie shadows on the ground. I knew I couldn't stay there. I needed to get away from them and find help. I packed my things as quietly as I could and started to hike back towards the trailhead. The forest was dark and foreboding at night. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made my heart leap. I moved as quickly and silently as possible, my flashlight guiding the way. After about an hour, I heard voices again. They were closer this time, and I realized the men were following the same trail. I left the path, hoping to lose them in the dense forest. The terrain was rough, but I used my hiking skills to navigate through it. I climbed over rocks, waded through streams, and pushed through thick underbrush. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but I knew they were still out there. Dawn was breaking by the time I reached a clearing. I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stop. I needed to find a way to contact someone for help. I looked around and spotted a ridge that might give me a better view of the area. I climbed up, hoping to see a road or a house. From the top of the ridge, I saw smoke rising in the distance. It was too far to tell if it was from a campfire or a house, but it was my best chance. I started towards it, keeping an eye out for any signs of the men. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the landscape. As I got closer, I realized the smoke was coming from a small cabin. Relief washed over me. I approached cautiously, not sure if it was safe. I knocked on the door, praying someone friendly would answer. An elderly man opened the door, his eyes widening in surprise. I quickly explained my situation, and he ushered me inside. He handed me a phone, and I called the police, describing the men and my location. The old man, who introduced himself as Joe, offered me a cup of tea while we waited. My hand shook as I held the cup, the adrenaline finally wearing off. Within an hour, the police arrived. They took my statement and began searching the area for the men. I thanked Joe for his kindness and watched as the officers fanned out into the forest. They assured me they would find the convicts and keep me safe. The police eventually found the men hiding in a nearby ravine. They were arrested without incident. The officers told me I had been lucky to escape unarmed. The men were desperate and dangerous, willing to do anything to avoid capture. I returned to my campsite with the police, who helped me gather my belongings. They escorted me back to the trailhead, where my car was still parked. I was grateful for their assistance, but shaken by the experience. The mountains, once a place of peace, now felt tainted by the danger I had faced. Driving back home, I couldn't stop thinking about the men and how close I had come to becoming their next victim. I had always felt confident in my survival skills, but this encounter had shown me just how vulnerable I could be. The next few days were a blur of police reports and questions from friends and family. Everyone was relieved I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The forest had always been my refuge, but now it felt like a place of lurking danger. I decided to take a break from hiking for a while. The memories were too fresh, the fear too real. Instead, I focused on finding new ways to enjoy nature without putting myself at risk. I took up gardening, finding solace in the calm, controlled environment of my backyard. Despite the trauma, I was grateful for my survival skills and quick thinking. They had saved my life. But I knew I would never forget that night in the Blue Ridge Mountains and the fear that it gripped me as I fled through the dark forest. With time, I began to heal. The nightmares became less frequent and the panic attacks subsided. We set out with excitement and laughter, for friends seeking solace in the embrace of nature. The woods seemed to welcome us, their ancient boughs reaching out in silent invitation. Little did we know the darkness that awaited amidst the shadows of the trees. The crackle of the campfire and the gentle rustling of leaves provided a symphony of comfort on that first night. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the promise of camaraderie. As the flames danced, our voices echoed with stories of old and dreams of the future. We were young and invincible, unaware of the fragile thread that bound our friendship. The night crept upon us like a thief, stealing away the warmth of the fire and leaving us vulnerable in its chilling embrace. Shadows danced upon the canvas of our tent, their shapes twisting with the wind. I awoke to a whisper in the darkness, a voice that sent shivers down my spine. At first, I thought it a dream, a figment of my restless mind. But the weight of dread hung heavy in the air. The voice belonged to Jake, our friend whose laughter had once echoed through these very woods. His words were soft and measured, yet laced with a coldness that froze my blood. Jake spoke of secrets buried beneath the earth, of a pact forged in the darkness of night. His words dripped with malice, twisting like serpents through the recesses of my mind. I dared not breathe, lest he hear the frantic pounding of my heart. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, a reflection of something dark and unfamiliar. Fear etched lines upon my face as I listened to Jake's chilling tale, a tale of betrayal woven with threads of envy and resentment. His words painted a portrait of a mind unhinged, driven by unseen forces. I glanced at the others, their faces illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the tent. Sleep claimed them still, oblivious to the treachery that lurked amidst our midst. Jake's voice grew stronger, his whispers weaving a web of deceit that threatened to ensnare us all. He spoke of a plan, a sinister design to rid himself of those he once called friends. The weight of his words pressed upon me like a leaden cloak. Panic clawed at my throat, yet I dared not move lest I betray my waking state. Time stretched into eternity as Jake's whispers filled the void, his presence a specter that loomed over our fragile sanctuary. The warmth of the fire had long since faded, leaving only the chill of uncertainty in its wake. I wrestled with disbelief and horror as Jake's plan unfolded before me, a tapestry of manipulation and cruelty woven with threads of deception. His gaze fell upon me then, eyes alight with a fervor that chilled me to the bone. I held my breath, praying that the others remained lost in the throes of sleep. A shadow passed over Jake's face, a flicker of doubt that momentarily clouded his intent. For a heartbeat, I dared to hope that reason might prevail. But the darkness within him held sway, its tendrils coiling around his heart like a serpent's embrace. He moved with a purpose born of madness, his steps deliberate and silent. I watched in helpless horror as Jake approached the others, his movements fluid yet betraying the weight of his intentions. My mind raced with desperate pleas unspoken. A hand reached out, its touch gentle yet fraught with menace. Jake's voice echoed through the silence, a whispered promise of betrayal that shattered the fragile peace of the night. I wanted to scream, to warn them of the danger that lurked in their midst. But fear held me captive, its icy grip tightening with each passing moment. The others stirred, their sleep-addled minds struggling to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before them. Jake's words slithered through the darkness, their venomous intent poisoning the air. Awakening to confusion and disbelief, They looked at Jake with dawning realization, a realization born of fear and disbelief. Betrayal hung between us like a veil, its weight crushing our once unbreakable bond. I watched as Jake's facade crumbled beneath the weight of his deception. His eyes burned with a mixture of triumph and remorse, the twisted reflection of the friend we once knew. Tension coiled within the confines of our tent, its walls closing in around us like a prison of shadows. Silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken accusations and shattered trust. The fire had long since died, leaving us to navigate the darkness with hearts heavy and minds reeling. Questions hung upon our tongues, their answers lost amidst the wreckage of our shattered friendship. Morning dawned upon a landscape forever changed, a landscape scarred by the echoes of betrayal and the shadows of doubt. We packed our belongings in silence, each step a painful reminder of what had been lost. Jake's presence lingered like a specter amidst the trees, his betrayal a wound that festered in the depths of our souls. The woods whispered secrets of their own, their ancient boughs bearing witness to our fractured bond. As we parted ways, the weight of Jake's betrayal settled upon us like a cloak of lead. Words remained unspoken, their absence a testament to the depths of our pain. Time passed in silence, each of us grappling with the aftermath of that fateful night. Trust proved elusive, its fragile threads unraveling beneath the weight of betrayal. Yet amidst the darkness, a seed of resilience took root, a quiet resolve to heal the wounds that had been inflicted upon our hearts. We sought solace in the embrace of new friendships and the promise of brighter days. The woods held no answers, their silence a reflection of the mysteries that dwell within the human heart. Years passed, and the memory of that night faded like the dying embers of a fire. I decided to take a solo camping trip to the Adirondack Mountains for some peace and quiet. The mountains had always been a place where I could clear my mind, and after a particularly stressful year, I needed a break. I found a spot by a clear brook and set up my tent, feeling content and relaxed. The first day was perfect. I hiked along a few trails, took some photos, and settled back at my camp with a good book. The sounds of nature were soothing. Birds chirping, the wind rustling the leaves, and the gentle flow of the brook created a symphony of tranquility. By evening, I had a small fire going and was cooking a simple meal. The stars were starting to peek through the twilight sky. Everything felt serene until I heard a distant noise that made my heart skip a beat, gunshots. It was hunting season, but this area was supposed to be off limits to hunters. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was far away. But the shots continued sporadically, growing closer. Unease settled in my stomach. I packed away my food quickly and doused the fire, hoping the darkness would conceal my presence. Curiosity got the better of me. I decided to move quietly towards the sounds, keeping to the shadows. I walked for about 10 minutes, the gunshots now loud and clear. I crouched behind a bush and peered out. In the clearing, a group of men were standing around, talking loudly, rifles slung over their shoulders. They were not wearing any hunting gear, which was odd. They had no regard for the environment, littering and trampling the underbrush. It was clear they weren't just hunters. Something else was going on. My pulse quickened. I had to get out of there and report this, but as I started to back away, I stepped on a twig, snapping it loudly. The men turned in my direction. Panic surged through me. I bolted, not caring about the noise I made anymore. I heard them shout, and then they started running after me. The forest was thick, and I used it to my advantage, darting between trees and ducking under low branches. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but adrenaline kept me moving. I could hear them getting closer, their heavy footsteps crashing through the foliage. I needed to find a place to hide. Up ahead, I saw a fallen tree with a hollowed-out base. I dove into it, covering myself with leaves and dirt. I lay there, trying to control my breathing. The men came into view, scanning the area. They spoke in harsh whispers, frustrated at losing sight of me. One of them kicked the tree I was hiding in, making my heart hammer against my chest. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. After what felt like an eternity, they moved on, their voices fading into the distance. I waited, afraid to move, but knowing I couldn't stay there forever. When I was sure they were gone, I crawled out and started moving again, slower this time, staying low and quiet. I needed to get back to my campsite and pack up. There was no way I could stay another night here. The darkness was complete now, making it difficult to see. I stumbled several times, scratching my hands and knees on the rough ground. When I finally reached my campsite, I hurriedly packed my things, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every sound made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. With my pack secured, I started down the trail, using my flashlight sparingly to avoid drawing attention. Hours passed as I trekked through the forest. I was exhausted but couldn't afford to stop. My mind raced with thoughts of what those men were doing and why they were so far into a restricted area. I had to get to safety and report what I'd seen. Just when I thought I was far enough away, I heard voices again. They were relentless, still searching for me. I left the trail, moving through the underbrush to avoid being seen. The terrain was rough, and I slipped several times, but I kept going. Dawn was breaking when I finally saw a ranger station in the distance. Relief washed over me. I stumbled towards it, my body aching and covered in dirt and scratches. I reached the door and pounded on it desperately. A ranger opened the door, eyes widening at the sight of me. I quickly explained what had happened, and they took me inside, locking the door behind me. I was safe, for now. The ranger called for backup, and soon other rangers arrived, armed and ready to investigate. They assured me that they would take care of the situation and that I had done the right thing by coming to them. As they set out to find the men, I couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of fear. The forest that once brought me peace had become a place of terror. I was taken to a nearby town where I could rest and recover. The authorities promised to keep me updated on their investigation. Days later, I learned that the men had been caught. They were indeed poachers, involved in illegal activities far beyond hunting. Though justice was served, the experience left a scar. I couldn't shake the memory of those men chasing me through the forest. The Australian outback had always been a place of mystery and adventure for me. I decided to take a solo trip to photograph the untouched beauty of the landscape. I set up camp near an old, dried-up riverbed, feeling the vast emptiness and rugged beauty of the place settle into my bones. The first day went smoothly. I captured stunning images of the red earth, the sparse vegetation, and the endless sky. As evening approached, I found a spot to camp, pitched my tent, and built a small fire. The silence of the outback was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a distant bird. The next morning, I set out early, hoping to catch the sunrise over the hills. As I wandered deeper into the terrain, I stumbled upon what looked like a mining operation. It was tucked away in a secluded area, well hidden from casual observers. I was curious but cautious. This wasn't marked on any map I'd seen. I decided to take a few photos from a distance, documenting the strange setup. There were makeshift tents, machinery, and a few men working with a sense of urgency. I was careful to stay hidden, not wanting to draw attention to myself. But as I clicked my camera, one of the men looked up and spotted me. A surge of adrenaline hit me. I turned to leave, trying to move quietly, but the terrain betrayed me. Loose rocks tumbled under my feet, and I heard shouts behind me. Panic set in. I broke into a run, the rough ground challenging my every step. The men were shouting, and I could hear them giving chase. The sun was scorching, and the landscape offered little in the way of cover. I ducked behind a large boulder, trying to catch my breath. I peered around the edge and saw 3 men, all with a hardened look, scanning the area. They were armed with tools that could easily be used as weapons. I knew I had to keep moving. I slipped away, using the sparse vegetation for cover. The outback's vastness now felt like a prison. The men's voices grew fainter, but I couldn't let my guard down. I headed towards a rocky outcrop, hoping it would provide better hiding spots. As I climbed the rocky terrain, I stumbled, cutting my hand on a sharp rock. I stifled a cry of pain, wrapping my hand in my shirt to stop the bleeding. Every sound seemed amplified, every movement a potential giveaway. The sun was high now, and there was no shade to protect me from its relentless heat. I found a narrow crevice in the rocks and squeezed into it, hoping it would conceal me. My breathing was ragged, heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the men's voices again, closer this time. They were determined, and I realized they must think I had discovered something important, something worth protecting at all costs. Time passed slowly. The men's voices ebbed and flowed, sometimes alarmingly close. I stayed hidden, barely daring to breathe. My mind raced with thoughts of escape. I needed to get back to my camp, get my things, and get out of there. But the path back seemed impossible with these men hunting me. Hours later, the sun was beginning to set. The voices had faded, but I knew better than to assume they'd given up. I carefully climbed out of my hiding spot, muscles aching from the cramped position. I moved slowly, sticking to the shadows cast by the setting sun. I retraced my steps, every sound putting me on edge. The outback was coming alive with nocturnal creatures, but they were the least of my worries. As I approached my camp, I saw it had been ransacked. My tent was slashed, and my supplies scattered. They'd been there, looking for me. Desperation set in. I grabbed what I could salvage, some water, a bit of food, and my camera. The photographs felt like a dangerous burden now. I decided to head for a nearby town, a grueling hike but my only hope. I knew the direction, but the terrain was treacherous, especially in the dark. The night was eerily quiet, broken only by the distant calls of wildlife. I moved as quickly as I dared, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every rustle in the bushes made my heart race. I felt like prey being stalked by relentless predators. I stumbled several times, exhaustion and fear taking their toll. The town was still miles away, and I had no idea if I could make it. But I had no choice. I pressed on, driven by sheer willpower and the fear of what would happen if those men caught me. As dawn approached, I finally saw the faint outline of the town in the distance. Relief flooded through me, giving me a burst of energy. I quickened my pace, desperate to reach safety. The sight of buildings was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I staggered into the town, drawing curious looks from the few early risers. I headed straight for the police station, barely able to speak as I recounted my ordeal. The officers took me seriously, and soon a team was dispatched to investigate the illegal mining operation. I was given food, water, and a place to rest. Exhaustion claimed me, and I slept fitfully, haunted by the chase. When I woke, the officers informed me that they had found the miners and arrested them. The operation was indeed illegal, and my photographs would be crucial evidence. I was safe, but the experience had left its mark. The vast, beautiful outback had turned into a landscape of terror. We had planned the camping trip for months. A group of us, old friends from university, decided to spend a long weekend in the Black Forest in Germany. The area was known for its dense woods, picturesque trails, and old-world charm. We were all excited to disconnect from our busy lives and reconnect with nature. The first day went smoothly. We set up camp near a clearing and spent the day hiking, laughing, and reminiscing about old times. By evening, we gathered around a campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The forest around us was dark and silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant hoot of an owl. On the second day, we decided to split up into smaller groups to explore different trails. I went with Emma, one of my closest friends. We wandered off the beaten path, enjoying the solitude and beauty of the forest. After a few hours, we realized we had strayed too far. We tried to find our way back, but everything looked the same. Emma suggested we keep walking in a straight line, hoping it would lead us to a familiar landmark. As we trudged through the thick underbrush, the sky started to darken, and a sense of unease crept in. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees towering and oppressive. We stumbled upon an old, narrow path. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was a path nonetheless. We followed it, hoping it would lead us to some form of civilization or at least a clearer area where we could get our bearings. After what felt like an eternity, we saw a small cabin in the distance. Relief washed over us. We approached cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was inside. There was no response. The cabin looked abandoned, with broken windows and a sagging roof. Emma pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The air was musty, and the interior was dimly lit by the fading daylight streaming through the grimy windows. The place was a mess, with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. We decided to rest for a moment and figure out our next move. As we explored the cabin, we found signs that someone had been there recently. Fresh food wrappers, a half-empty water bottle, and a map of the forest spread out on a table. A chill ran down my spine. Whoever was here, they couldn't be far. We heard voices outside, speaking in a language we couldn't understand. Panic set in. We peeked through a crack in the window and saw a group of men approaching the cabin. They were carrying large bags and looked rough, like they had been living off the grid for a while. Emma and I ducked down, trying to stay out of sight. The men entered the cabin, and we hid behind an old wardrobe. We listened to their conversation, trying to make sense of it. From their gestures and the contents of their bags, it became clear they were smugglers using the cabin as a hideout. Our hearts pounded in our chests as we tried to figure out what to do. We had to get out of there and warn our friends, but any movement risked giving us away. Emma gestured towards the back door, and we decided to make a run for it when the men were distracted. One of the men left the cabin, and the others seemed to be arguing over something. We took our chance. We slipped out the back door and ran into the forest, trying to be as quiet as possible. The adrenaline was pumping, and every sound seemed amplified. We ran for what felt like hours, not stopping until we were sure we had put enough distance between us and the cabin. We had no idea where we were, but we couldn't stop. The forest was dense, and the darkness made it even harder to navigate. We finally found a small clearing and paused to catch our breath. We needed to find our friends and warn them about the smugglers. Emma suggested climbing a tree to get a better view of our surroundings. She climbed up while I kept watch below. From her vantage point, Emma saw a faint light in the distance. It could be our campsite, or at least a safer place than the forest. We headed in that direction, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. The forest seemed alive with unseen dangers. The light grew brighter as we got closer. It was indeed our campsite. We burst into the clearing, startling our friends who were gathered around the fire. They were relieved to see us, but concerned about our frantic state. We quickly told them about the cabin and the smugglers. The mood turned serious. We needed to leave immediately and find a way to alert the authorities. We packed up our gear in record time and set off towards the nearest town, following the main trail. The journey back was tense. Every sound in the forest made us jump, and we kept looking over our shoulders, expecting to see the smugglers. The forest, once a place of adventure and beauty, now felt menacing and hostile. After several hours, we reached the edge of the forest and saw the lights of the town. Relief washed over us, but we knew we weren't safe yet. We headed straight for the police station and reported what we had seen. The police took our story seriously and sent a team to investigate the cabin. We stayed in the town, too shaken to return to the forest. The next day, the police confirmed they had found the smugglers and their hideout. They thanked us for our information and assured us the area was now safe. I had planned a hiking trip for months. The Rocky Mountains had always called to me, with their towering peaks and rugged beauty. I packed my gear and set up early in the morning, eager to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. The forecast had been clear, but the mountains are unpredictable, and I was about to find out just how dangerous they could be. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp, and the trail was challenging but rewarding. I set up camp by a small stream and enjoyed the solitude, the only sounds being the rustling leaves and distant calls of wildlife. I felt at peace, disconnected from the world and its worries. The next morning, I woke to overcast skies. I packed up quickly, hoping to make good progress before any potential weather changes. By midday, the clouds had darkened and a biting wind had picked up. Snow began to fall, light at first, but it quickly turned into a blizzard. Visibility dropped, and I struggled to stay on the trail. Panic set in as I realized I was losing my bearings. The snow was relentless, and my clothes were quickly soaked through. I needed to find shelter and fast. I pushed forward, hoping to find some form of refuge. After what felt like hours, I saw the outline of a cabin through the swirling snow. Relief flooded me as I stumbled towards it. The cabin was small and old, but it was my only chance of surviving the storm. I knocked on the door, my hand trembling from the cold. There was no answer. Desperate, I tried the handle, and to my surprise, the door creaked open. I stepped inside, shaking off the snow and calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" The interior was dimly lit by a small wood stove, casting flickering shadows on the walls. A man emerged from the shadows, his face stern and ice cold. He was tall and rugged, with a wild beard and clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in weeks. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low and threatening. "I'm lost," I stammered. The storm caught me by surprise. "I just need shelter until it passes." He stared at me for a long moment before nodding curtly. "You can stay," he said, "but don't touch anything and stay out of my way." I thanked him, relieved to be out of the storm, but his demeanor made me uneasy. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with survival gear and canned food scattered around. It was clear this man valued his solitude and was prepared to defend it. The hours passed slowly. The man, who introduced himself as Henry, spoke little and watched me closely. I tried to make small talk, but his curt responses made it clear he didn't want to engage. I wondered what had driven him to such isolation. As night fell, the wind howled outside, and the cabin creaked under the weight of the snow. I tried to sleep, but the tension in the air kept me awake. I couldn't shake the feeling that Henry was hiding something, and his constant vigilance only heightened my unease. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside. It was faint, but in the silence of the cabin, it was unmistakable. Henry stiffened and grabbed a rifle from the corner. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice barely a whisper. He moved towards the door, his steps silent and deliberate. I watched as he disappeared into the storm. My mind raced with fear and curiosity. What was out there? Minutes felt like hours, and then I heard voices, angry, muffled voices. I strained to hear, but the wind swallowed their words. Henry returned, his face grim. "There's a group of men out there," he said. "They've been following me for days. They want my supplies." Panic surged through me. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "We stay quiet and hope they move on," Henry replied. "If they find us, we'll have to defend ourselves." He handed me a small knife. "Just in case." The weight of the blade in my hand was both comforting and terrifying. The night dragged on, every creak and groan of the cabin magnified by my fear. The voices outside grew louder, closer. Henry's grip on his rifle tightened, and I could see the strain in his eyes. He was a man used to surviving alone, not sharing his space with a stranger. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door. "Open up," a voice demanded. Henry motioned for me to stay back. "We're armed," he shouted back. "Leave now, and no one gets hurt." There was a tense silence, then another bang, this time louder. The door splintered, and a group of men burst in. They were rough-looking, desperate. "We just want the supplies," one of them said, his eyes darting between us. Henry raised his rifle. "You're not getting anything," he growled. The tension snapped like a breaking wire. One of the men lunged at Henry, and chaos erupted. I found myself in the middle of a violent struggle, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. I fought back, driven by sheer survival instinct. Somehow, in the frenzy, I managed to slip out the door. The storm had lessened, but the cold was still brutal. I ran, the snow crunching under my boots, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. I stumbled through the forest, the sound of the fight fading behind me. My heart pounded in my ears, and my muscles burned with exertion. I couldn't stop, not even for a moment. The fear of being followed kept me moving. As dawn broke, I saw the outline of a road through the trees. Relief washed over me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I had to find help, alert someone to what had happened. I pushed forward, my legs heavy and my mind numb with exhaustion. I reached the road and flagged down the first car that passed. The driver, a kind older man, took one look at my disheveled state and let me in. I explained what had happened, my voice trembling with fatigue and fear. We drove to the nearest town, where I contacted the authorities. They assured me they would investigate and thanked me for the information. I waited anxiously for news, every minute feeling like an eternity. Eventually, the police confirmed they had found the cabin. The intruders had fled, and Henry was alive, though injured. They commended me for my bravery and assured me the area was now secure. I had been planning my solo camping trip to the Smoky Mountains for months. The need to escape from the daily grind and find some peace in nature was overwhelming. I packed my gear, double-checked everything, and set out early on a Friday morning. The weather was perfect, and I felt an immediate sense of relief as I drove away from the city. I arrived at the campsite by late afternoon and set up my tent near a small, babbling creek. The area was secluded, with only a few other campers spread out in the distance. It was exactly what I needed. After setting up camp, I decided to explore a bit before dinner. The forest was lush and green, filled with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. As the sun began to set, I returned to my camp, started a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. The solitude was comforting, and I felt a deep sense of contentment. After dinner, I sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the night. It was a perfect ending to my first day in the mountains. The next morning, I woke early and decided to go for a hike. I packed a day bag with essentials and set off on a nearby trail. The scenery was breathtaking, and I took my time, stopping frequently to take pictures and enjoy the view. As the trail wound deeper into the forest, I felt a sense of adventure and freedom. Around midday, I found a beautiful spot by a waterfall and decided to rest. I ate my lunch, dipped my feet in the cool water, and enjoyed the peaceful surroundings. It was then that I heard voices in the distance. At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming it was just other hikers. But as the voices grew louder, I could tell something was wrong. Curiosity got the better of me, and I quietly moved closer to investigate. Hidden behind some bushes, I saw a man and a woman arguing. The argument quickly escalated, and to my horror, the man started to assault the woman. I froze, unsure of what to do. My heart raced as I watched the brutal attack unfold. The woman tried to fight back, but the man was too strong. I knew I had to do something, but fear paralyzed me. Suddenly, the woman screamed, and the man looked around, spotting me in the bushes. Our eyes locked, and I felt a surge of panic. He knew I had seen everything. Without thinking, I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I could hear the man yelling behind me, his footsteps crashing through the underbrush. I had no idea where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The forest seemed to close in around me, the thick vegetation making it difficult to navigate. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my heart pounding in my chest. The man's shouts grew fainter, but I didn't dare slow down. I had to put as much distance between us as possible. I found a small ravine and slid down, hoping it would hide my trail. I crouched behind a large boulder, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. The forest was eerily silent, and I strained to hear any sign of pursuit. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Just when I thought I was safe, I heard the crunch of footsteps above me. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find me. The footsteps paused, and I could hear him cursing under his breath. He was close, too close. My mind raced with possibilities, but there was nowhere to go. The footsteps eventually moved away, and I let out a shaky breath. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I had to find a way back to my campsite and get help. I waited until I was sure he was gone, then carefully climbed out of the ravine and continued moving through the forest. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart leap. I felt like a hunted animal, constantly looking over my shoulder. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I had to find my way back before it got dark. I finally stumbled upon a familiar landmark and realized I was close to my campsite. Relief washed over me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I quickened my pace, glancing around nervously. When I reached my campsite, I quickly packed up my things, not wanting to spend another night in the open. As I finished packing, I heard a noise behind me. I turned to see the man emerging from the trees, a look of rage on his face. My blood ran cold. He had found me. I grabbed my pack and ran, not looking back. My only thought was to reach my car and get out of there. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, but I finally saw the parking area through the trees. My car was parked at the edge, and I fumbled for my keys as I ran. The man was gaining on me, his footsteps pounding behind me. I reached my car and threw my pack inside, jumping into the driver's seat. My hand shook as I tried to start the engine. The man was almost upon me, his face twisted with anger. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into gear, peeling out of the parking area. The man banged on the back of the car as I sped away, his furious shouts fading into the distance. I drove to the nearest ranger station, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. When I arrived, I rushed inside, breathless and terrified. The rangers listened to my story, their faces grim. They assured me they would send a team to investigate and find the man. The experience left me shaken and wary. The Smoky Mountains, once a place of beauty and peace, now held a darker memory. I couldn't shake the image of the woman's terrified face or the man's rage. I knew it would be a long time before I felt safe in the wilderness again. The rangers later informed me that they found the woman, alive but injured. The man had fled, and they were still searching for him. I felt a mix of relief and guilt, knowing I had done what I could but wishing I could have done more. In the days that followed, I tried to process what had happened. The sense of vulnerability and fear was hard to shake. I had always loved the solitude of nature, but now it felt tainted by the violence I had witnessed. I decided to take a break from camping and hiking, focusing on activities closer to home. The city, with all its noise and chaos, felt safer than the wild, unpredictable wilderness. I hoped that, in time, I would regain my confidence and love for the outdoors. We had been planning our camping trip to the Grand Canyon for months. It was supposed to be a fun family getaway, a chance to disconnect from our busy lives and reconnect with each other. My wife, Karen, our 2 kids, Emily and Jake, and I packed up our gear and set off early one Friday morning, full of excitement and anticipation. The drive was long, but the scenery was beautiful. We reached the campsite by late afternoon and set up our tent near a secluded spot with a great view of the canyon. The kids ran around, exploring, while Karen and I finished unpacking. We built a fire and cooked dinner, enjoying the peace and quiet. After dinner, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The kids were thrilled to be out in nature, and Karen and I felt a deep sense of contentment. We turned in early, exhausted from the day's travel but looking forward to the adventures ahead. The next morning, we woke up to the sound of birds chirping. After a hearty breakfast, we decided to hike one of the trails that led deeper into the canyon. The views were breathtaking, and we took our time, stopping frequently to take pictures and enjoy the scenery. As we hiked, I noticed a group of men not far behind us. At first, I thought they were just fellow campers, but something about them seemed off. They were watching us closely, and their presence made me uneasy. I decided to keep an eye on them but didn't mention anything to Karen or the kids. By late afternoon, we returned to our campsite, tired but happy. The men were nowhere in sight, and I brushed off my earlier concerns. We spent the rest of the day relaxing, fishing in a nearby stream, and playing games. As the sun set, we prepared another meal and settled in for the night. That night, I woke up to a noise outside the tent. I quietly slipped out of my sleeping bag and peeked through the tent flap. In the dim light of the campfire, I saw one of the men from earlier rifling through our supplies. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized we were being stalked by thieves. I carefully woke Karen and told her what I had seen. We needed to protect the kids and find a way to safety. We decided to wait until the men left before making a move. After what felt like hours, the man finally rejoined his group, and they disappeared into the darkness. At first light, we packed up our campsite as quietly as possible, hoping to leave before the thieves returned. We needed to get to the park ranger station for help. The kids, sensing our urgency, cooperated without question, their usual chatter replaced by silent, anxious glances. As we made our way back to the main trail, I heard footsteps behind us. I turned to see the group of men approaching, their expressions menacing. They had discovered we were leaving and were determined to stop us. I told Taryn and the kids to run ahead while I stayed behind to slow the men down. I grabbed a large branch and faced the approaching thieves. They demanded our supplies, convinced we had something valuable. I tried to reason with them, but they were relentless. I swung the branch, trying to keep them at bay, but there were too many of them. Karen and the kids managed to put some distance between us, and I broke away, running after them. The men chased us through the forest, their shouts growing louder. We were exhausted and scared, but adrenaline kept us moving. We reached a steep incline and scrambled up, hoping to lose the men in the dense foliage. The climb was treacherous, and we slipped and stumbled, but we couldn't afford to stop. The men were close behind, their determination frightening. At the top of the incline, we found a narrow path that led to a cliff overlooking the canyon. With no other options, we followed the path, praying it would lead us to safety. The path was perilous, and one wrong step could send us tumbling into the abyss. Just as we thought we had lost them, the men reappeared, blocking our way forward. We were trapped, with the cliff on one side and the men on the other. I knew we had to fight if we wanted to survive. I picked up another branch and stood my ground, ready to protect my family. The leader of the group lunged at me, and we struggled, each trying to gain the upper hand. Taryn and the kids huddled together, terrified. In the chaos, I managed to knock the leader off balance, sending him tumbling down the cliff. The other men hesitated, shocked by their leader's fall. Seizing the moment, I shouted for Taryn and the kids to run. We bolted past the stunned men and continued along the path, not daring to look back. The remaining thieves, now leaderless, were disorganized and less determined. We had a chance to escape. We ran until we reached a clearing where we saw the ranger station in the distance. Relief washed over us as we stumbled towards it, our legs barely able to carry us any further. We burst into the station, breathless and frantic, and told the rangers what had happened. The rangers quickly organized a search party and went after the men. They assured us we were safe now and provided us with food and water. The ordeal had left us shaken, but we were grateful to be alive and together. Later, we learned that the rangers had apprehended the remaining thieves. They had been targeting campers, stealing supplies, and causing havoc in the park. We were lucky to have escaped with our lives. The experience left a deep scar on our hearts. Our peaceful family camping trip had turned into a nightmare, but it also brought us closer together. We realized the importance of staying vigilant and prepared, even in the most serene settings. As we drove back home, we talked about the trip and what we had learned. The kids were brave and resilient, and Karen and I were proud of how we had all handled the situation. The memory of the Grand Canyon would always be a mix of beauty and terror for us. We decided to take a break from camping for a while. The Appalachian Trail was always on my bucket list. Its sprawling landscapes, challenging hikes, and the chance to disconnect from the world drew me in. My name's Alex, and I've been planning this trip for months. I started from Springer Mountain, Georgia, and aimed to make it to Harper's Ferry. It was supposed to be a solo journey, a chance to find myself. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. The weather was perfect, and I met a few other hikers along the way. Everyone had a story, a reason for being there. But mostly, I enjoyed the solitude, the peace that came from being surrounded by nature. About a week in, I started to notice signs of someone else on the trail. Small things at first, campsites that looked freshly used, footprints that didn't match mine. It wasn't unusual, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way the hair on the back of my neck stood up every time I noticed one of these signs. One afternoon, I took a detour from the main trail to find a water source. I came across a small, clear stream and decided to refill my bottles. As I bent down, I heard a rustling in the bushes. I looked up and saw a man watching me from a distance. His clothes were dirty and tattered, and his hair was wild and unkempt. "Hey there," I called out, trying to sound friendly. He didn't respond, just stood there staring at me. After a few awkward moments, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I shrugged it off as just another hiker who preferred solitude. That night, I set up camp a little earlier than usual. As I cooked my dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. I told myself it was just nerves and tried to enjoy the solitude. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. They were slow, deliberate. My heart pounded as I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent. Shining the light around, I saw nothing. The footsteps stopped, and everything was silent again. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening, waiting. The next morning, I packed up quickly and got back on the trail. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone was following me. I decided to push on harder, hoping to put some distance between me and whatever or whoever was out there. By late afternoon, I came across a small, abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I was tired and needed a break, so I decided to check it out. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty. There were old cans of food, a rusty stove, and a bed with a rotting mattress. As I explored, I found a stash of newspapers and magazines, all with headlines about government conspiracies and surveillance. That's when I heard the door creak open behind me. I turned to see the man from the stream standing in the doorway, holding a shotgun. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his eyes wild with fear and anger. "Are you one of them? Are you a government agent?" I raised my hands, trying to calm him down. No, I'm just a hiker. I swear." I got off the trail to find water and needed a place to rest. He didn't lower the gun. "You're lying. I know they're out here, watching me. You think you can fool me?" I took a step back, my mind racing. "I'm not lying. I'm just passing through. Please, I don't want any trouble." He advanced, the gun still trained on me. "You're not going anywhere. You're going to tell me the truth, or I'll make you." Panic surged through me. I had to get out of there. I glanced around, looking for an escape route. The only way out was past him and into the woods. I took a deep breath and bolted for the door, knocking him off balance. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear him shouting behind me, firing the shotgun into the air. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches scratching my face and arms. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. Finally, I stopped to catch my breath, listening for any sign of him. The forest was silent, but I knew he was still out there, somewhere. I couldn't stay in one place for long. I continued moving, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. As night fell, I found a small, hidden spot under a rock outcropping and huddled there, too scared to build a fire or even move. Every sound made me jump, but I couldn't afford to rest. The next day, I kept moving, following the trail markers as best I could. I had to find other hikers or a ranger station, someone who could help. I rationed my food and water, knowing I might be out here longer than I planned. By the third day, I was exhausted and dehydrated. My mind was starting to play tricks on me. I kept seeing shadows in the trees, hearing footsteps that weren't there. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. On the fourth day, I stumbled across a group of hikers. They were startled by my appearance, dirty, scratched up, and clearly terrified. I told them what had happened, and they helped me contact the rangers. The rangers searched the area but found no sign of the hermit. They told me there had been reports of a man living off the grid, but he was always elusive. They assured me I was safe now, but I couldn't shake the fear. I left the Appalachian Trail early, my dream of completing it shattered. The experience left me scarred, both physically and mentally. I still loved hiking, but I couldn't bring myself to go back to the trail. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear footsteps outside my window. The Cascade Mountains were supposed to be my escape. After a stressful year, I needed a break from everything: work, city life, the constant noise. I planned a solo hiking trip, aiming to lose myself in the tranquility of the forest. I had always found peace in nature, and this trip was no different, at least initially. The first few days were perfect. I followed well-marked trails, set up my tent near clear streams, and took in the breathtaking views. I rarely saw other hikers, which suited me fine. It was early in the season, and the trails weren't crowded yet. On the fourth day, I decided to take a less traveled path. It was an old logging road that had been partially reclaimed by the forest. The map showed it leading to a picturesque overlook, and I couldn't resist the promise of solitude and beauty. The further I walked, the less maintained the trail became. Tall grass and shrubs encroached on the path, and fallen trees sometimes blocked my way. I pushed on, excited by the adventure. After a few hours, I noticed a faint smell in the air. It was familiar but out of place in the wilderness, an earthy, pungent odor that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed the smell up the path, pushing through dense undergrowth. That's when I stumbled upon it, a hidden grow operation, nestled in a clearing. Rows of marijuana plants stretched out before me, surrounded by makeshift irrigation systems and solar panels. My heart raced. I knew immediately this was an illegal operation. The setup was too hidden, too secretive. I turned to leave, but it was too late. A man stepped out from behind a tree, blocking my path. He was rugged, with a weather-beaten face and cold eyes. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low and threatening. I'm sorry. I just got lost." "I'll leave now," I stammered, trying to sound calm. "Too late for that," he said, pulling out a walkie-talkie. "We've got a problem." Someone found the site. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. Shouts and the sound of pursuit followed me. My mind raced with fear and adrenaline. I had to get away, find help, but I was deep in the forest, far from any known trail. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were on fire. I could still hear them behind me, closer now. I stumbled upon a creek and followed it downstream, hoping the water would mask my scent and cover my tracks. Night was falling, and the forest grew darker. I slipped and fell, scraping my hands and knees on the rocks. I forced myself up, ignoring the pain. I had to keep moving. The shouts were getting closer, echoing through the trees. I found a small cave and crawled inside, pressing myself against the cold, damp rock. I tried to control my breathing, to stay silent. Footsteps approached, and I held my breath. They were so close I could hear their voices clearly. She can't have gone far. Spread out and find her. We can't let her get away. I stayed in the cave for hours, afraid to move. Eventually, the voices faded, and the forest grew silent again. Exhaustion and fear kept me awake all night, listening for any sign of danger. At dawn, I crept out of my hiding place and continued downstream. I had to find a way out, but I had no idea where I was. I hadn't seen any trail markers or signs of civilization in hours. By midday, I stumbled upon an old fire lookout tower. It was abandoned but offered a vantage point. I climbed up and scanned the horizon, hoping to see a road or a building, anything that could lead me to safety. In the distance, I saw smoke. It could be a campsite or another part of the grow operation. I couldn't be sure. I decided to head in the opposite direction, hoping to avoid any further danger. The sun was high, and the forest was oppressively hot. I rationed my water and food, knowing it might be days before I found help. As night fell again, I found a hollow log and crawled inside, too afraid to risk a fire. Sleep came in fits, interrupted by every rustle and snap in the forest. I woke at dawn, stiff and sore, but determined to keep moving. The third day, I stumbled upon a dirt road. Relief flooded through me. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a town or a ranger station. My pace quickened, driven by the hope of rescue. Hours later, I heard the sound of an engine. I ducked into the bushes, fearing it might be the growers. A beat-up truck rattled past, driven by a grizzled old man. I hesitated, then decided to risk it. I stepped out and flagged him down. He stopped, and I approached cautiously. "Please, can you help me? I got lost, and there are men after me," I explained, my voice shaking. He eyed me warily but nodded. "Get in. Let's get you to safety." As we drove, I told him everything. He listened, his expression grim. He promised to take me to the nearest town and contact the authorities. We reached a small town by evening. The man dropped me at the sheriff's office, where I told my story again. They took me seriously and launched an investigation. I was safe, but the ordeal left me shaken. I left the Cascade Mountains earlier than planned, my love for hiking tainted by fear. We arrived at the Boundary Waters in Minnesota, a group of 6 friends eager for a weekend of camping and canoeing. The wilderness stretched out before us, pristine and serene. We set up our camp near the water, the evening sun casting a golden glow over the lake. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and the sound of distant winds calling. Our first night was perfect. We sat around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The stars above were brilliant, undimmed by city lights. I felt at peace, disconnected from the chaos of everyday life. We turned in late, exhausted but happy. The next morning, we decided to explore deeper into the woods. We paddled our canoes across the lake and hiked into the forest. The trees were dense and the underbrush thick, but we enjoyed the challenge. It felt like an adventure, a chance to truly immerse ourselves in nature. As we wandered, we stumbled upon an old, overgrown trail. Curiosity got the better of us, and we followed it. The path led us to a clearing with a dilapidated cabin at its center. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt off. We debated whether to approach, but our curiosity won out. We stepped closer, peering through the grimy windows. Inside, the cabin was a mess of old furniture and broken items. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for years. We decided to leave, not wanting to trespass further. But as we turned to go, we heard a rustling in the trees. A man emerged from the woods, disheveled and wild-eyed. He carried a rifle slung over his shoulder. His face twisted in anger as he saw us. "What are you doing here?" he barked, his voice rough and threatening. We tried to explain, to apologize, but he wouldn't listen. "Get off my land," he shouted, raising the rifle. Fear gripped us, and we ran. The man didn't follow, but his voice echoed through the trees, promising we wouldn't get away if we came back. We made it back to our camp, shaken but unarmed. We decided to pack up and leave the next morning, not wanting to risk another encounter. That night, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, set our nerves on edge. We kept the campfire burning bright, hoping it would keep any threats at bay. Sleep was elusive, and I found myself staring into the darkness, listening for any signs of danger. In the early hours of the morning, I heard footsteps outside my tent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. I held my breath, praying they would pass by. But then the zipper of my tent began to move. I scrambled for my flashlight, shining it towards the sound. The man from the cabin stood there, his eyes glinting in the light. "I warned you," he hissed. I yelled, waking my friends. The man backed away, disappearing into the night. We didn't sleep after that, too afraid he would come back. As soon as dawn broke, we packed up our gear and headed for the canoes. We paddled across the lake in silence, the morning fog thick and eerie. It felt like we were being watched, the man's threat hanging over us. We reached the opposite shore and started hiking back towards the trailhead, hoping to reach safety before he found us again. The forest was dense, making it easy to get lost. We tried to stay on the trail, but it was overgrown and difficult to follow. As we moved deeper into the woods, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every now and then, we heard the crack of a branch or the rustle of leaves, but we saw no one. Suddenly, a shot rang out, echoing through the trees. We dropped to the ground, panic setting in. "Keep moving," one of my friends urged. We scrambled to our feet and ran, the forest a blur around us. Another shot followed, closer this time. He was hunting us. We came to a small stream and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead us to safety. The water was cold and fast-moving, but it masked our footsteps. We moved as quickly as we could, the sound of the stream drowning out our pursuer. But we knew he was still out there, tracking us. As the day wore on, we grew tired and hungry. We stopped briefly to catch our breath and eat, but we didn't dare rest for long. The man was relentless, and we couldn't afford to be caught. We continued following the stream, praying it would lead us to help. By late afternoon, we reached a larger river. We decided to follow it downstream, hoping it would lead us to civilization. Our legs were sore, our spirits low, but we kept moving. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the riverbank. We found a spot to cross the river, the water shallow enough to wade through. On the other side, the forest was less dense, the trail easier to follow. But our sense of urgency didn't wane. We knew the man was still out there, somewhere. As night fell, we saw lights in the distance. It was a small cabin, and we approached cautiously. Inside, an elderly couple welcomed us in, their faces kind and concerned. We explained our situation, and they immediately called the authorities. The police arrived within the hour, armed and ready. They took our statements and set out to find the man. We stayed with the couple, grateful for their hospitality and safety. It felt like a nightmare, but we knew we were finally safe. The next day, the police informed us they had found the man's cabin but not the man himself. They assured us he wouldn't be able to continue hiding in the woods for long. We decided to cut our trip short and head home, the experience too traumatic to stay. As we drove away from the boundary wires, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The man's wild eyes haunted my thoughts. We had survived, but the fear lingered. The wilderness, once a place of peace, now felt dangerous and unpredictable. Back home, we tried to return to normal life. But the memory of that weekend stayed with us. We shared our story, warning others of the dangers that lurked in the remote corners of the world. It was a reminder that not all threats come from nature itself, but from those who hide within it. In time, the fear faded, but the lesson remained. We had been lucky to escape with our lives. The boundary waters would always hold a place in my heart, but I knew I would never venture so deep into its woods again. The wilderness was beautiful, but it could also be terrifying. We had faced a danger we never expected, and it had changed us. The man's threat had been real, and it had tested our survival skills and our resolve. But in the end, we had made it out, stronger and wiser for the experience. I had always wanted to explore the Scottish Highlands, to hike through its rugged beauty and lose myself in its vast landscapes. When I finally got the chance, I packed my bags and set off alone, eager for adventure. I planned to spend a week hiking and camping, immersing myself in the wild and remote terrain. On the third day of my trip, I reached a small village nestled in a valley. It was quaint, with stone cottages and narrow, winding streets. The locals seemed reserved but polite, and I found a small inn where I could rest and stock up on supplies. The innkeeper, a burly man with a thick accent, eyed me curiously as I checked in. "You here for the hiking?" Then he asked. I nodded, explaining my route through the hills. His expression grew serious. "Be careful out there," he warned. "The weather can change quick, and it's easy to get lost." I thanked him for the advice and retired to my room. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The village was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional rustle of the wind. I chalked it up to nerves and tried to sleep, but my dreams were troubled and restless. The next morning, I set out early. The sky was overcast, a heavy mist clinging to the hills. As I hiked, I noticed the landscape becoming more rugged and desolate. There were no signs of other hikers, just the occasional distant call of a bird. It felt like I was the only person for miles. By midday, I reached a remote glen. The air was still, and the silence was oppressive. As I paused to rest, I heard voices. I crept closer, staying hidden behind a rock. In a clearing, a group of men were gathered, speaking in hushed tones. They looked rough, with weathered faces and heavy jackets. I strained to hear their conversation. They were talking about shipments and routes, and something about avoiding the authorities. My heart began to race as I realized I had stumbled upon something illegal. I tried to back away quietly, but I must have made a noise, because one of the men looked up sharply. "Who's there?" he barked. I froze, my mind racing. I turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush. Shouts erupted behind me, and I knew they were coming after me. Panic surged through me as I ran, my only thought to get as far away as possible. I stumbled and fell, scraping my hands on the rocky ground. As I scrambled to my feet, I heard footsteps closing in. I darted into a thicket, hoping to hide. The footsteps slowed, and I heard the men talking. "He can't have gone far," one of them said. "Spread out and find him. We can't let him get away." I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, the footsteps moved away, and I dared to peek out. The men were gone, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I crept through the woods, keeping low and trying to stay hidden. My mind was racing. I needed to get back to the village to find help. But every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I felt like I was being hunted. As evening approached, I found a small cave and decided to hide there for the night. I was exhausted and scared, but I knew I couldn't risk moving in the dark. I huddled in the cave, my ears straining for any sound. Sleep was impossible. The next morning, I continued my journey, staying off the main trails and moving as quickly as I could. The landscape was unforgiving, and I struggled to keep my bearings. Every now and then, I thought I heard voices or footsteps, but I couldn't be sure. By midday, I stumbled upon a narrow road. Relief washed over me as I saw a car approaching. I waved frantically, and the car slowed. The driver, an older woman, looked at me with concern as I explained my situation. She offered me a ride back to the village, and I gratefully accepted. As we drove, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the men to appear. The woman noticed my anxiety and tried to reassure me. "You're safe now," she said. "We'll get you to the police." Back in the village, I went straight to the police station. I told them everything I had seen and experienced. The officers listened intently, their faces grim. They assured me they would investigate and offered me a place to stay while they looked into it. The next few days were a blur of fear and paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that the men were still out there, watching and waiting. The police kept me updated, but they hadn't found any trace of the men or their illegal activities. Finally, the day came for me to leave the village. The innkeeper drove me to the nearest train station, and I boarded a train back to the city. As the village faded into the distance, I felt a sense of relief. But the fear lingered, a reminder of how close I had come to danger. Back home, I tried to return to normal life. But the memory of those men and the fear they instilled in me stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. It was a reminder of how quickly a peaceful adventure could turn into a nightmare. I never did find out what the men were up to, or if the police ever caught them. The Dolomites in Italy had always called to me. Their jagged peaks and serene valleys promised adventure and tranquility. I planned a solo camping trip, hoping to find some peace after a stressful year. Little did I know, I would find anything but. I arrived at the base of the mountains early in the morning, the air crisp and fresh. I parked my car, strapped on my backpack, and set off. The trails were well marked, and I felt confident as I hiked higher, the scenery growing more breathtaking with every step. By midday, I found a perfect spot to set up camp, a small clearing with a view of the valley below. I pitched my tent, ate a quick lunch, and decided to explore the area before nightfall. There was a narrow path leading deeper into the forest, and curiosity got the better of me. As I walked, the forest grew denser. The trail became less distinct, but I pressed on, enjoying the solitude. Suddenly, I heard voices. Instinctively, I ducked behind a tree, peering through the branches. In a small clearing ahead, a group of men were gathered around a large crate. They were speaking in hushed tones, their demeanor tense. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was clear they were up to something illicit. My heart pounded as I realized I had stumbled upon a smuggling operation. I slowly backed away, careful not to make any noise. But in my haste, I stepped on a twig. It snapped loudly. The men's heads jerked up, their eyes scanning the forest. I turned and ran, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. I could hear them shouting, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush behind me. I had to get back to my camp, grab my things, and get out of there. I reached my tent and hastily shoved my belongings into my backpack. The voices were getting closer. I couldn't stay on the main trail, they would catch me for sure. I plunged into the forest, gearing off the path and hoping to lose them in the dense undergrowth. The forest seemed to close in around me, the branches clawing at my clothes and skin. I stumbled over roots and rocks, barely able to see where I was going. The men were relentless, their shouts echoing through the trees. I couldn't outrun them forever. As night fell, the forest became a dark maze. My legs ached, and I was on the verge of collapse. I needed to find a place to hide. I spotted a rocky outcrop ahead and scrambled up, wedging myself into a narrow crevice. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The men passed by, their flashlights sweeping the forest floor. I could hear their frustrated muttering as they searched. After what felt like hours, they moved on, their voices fading into the distance. I stayed hidden, too scared to move. When dawn broke, I cautiously emerged from my hiding spot. My body was stiff and sore, but I couldn't afford to rest. I needed to get to the nearest town and report what I had seen. I had no idea how far I had strayed from the trail or which direction to go. I climbed a hill to get my bearings. In the distance, I saw a small village. Relief washed over me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I made my way down, sticking to the cover of the trees as much as possible. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. As I approached the village, I saw a small cafe. I stumbled inside, looking disheveled and terrified. The few patrons stared at me, and the owner hurried over, concern etched on her face. I explained what had happened, my voice trembling. The local authorities were called, and I was taken to the police station. I recounted my ordeal, giving them as much detail as I could about the men and their operation. The officers listened intently, assuring me they would investigate. They arranged for me to stay in a nearby guest house while they looked into the matter. The guest house owner, a kind elderly woman, tried to comfort me, but sleep eluded me. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of the wind, made me jump. The next day, the police informed me that they had found evidence of a smuggling operation, but no sign of the men. They believed the smugglers had fled once they realized they had been discovered. They assured me I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I cut my trip short and returned home, my dream of a peaceful retreat shattered. The Dolomites, once a symbol of beauty and tranquility, now held a darker memory. The image of those men and their relentless pursuit haunted my thoughts,